Hello everyone, welcome to Bold Conjectures with Paras Chopra. I know this episode is coming after a long hiatus. Well, that's because I got busy with starting another company where I'm trying to build a game-like platform for achieving life goals. During my research into what makes a fun game, I came across today's guest, Thi Nguyen, a philosopher of games at University of Utah. Before you wonder what a philosopher of games does full time, I should also mention that T is a prolific writer as well. He used to write a popular food blog, and in 2021, he wrote a book called Games Agency as Art that won the 2021 book prize by American Philosophical Association. Now he's writing another book, which should be out soon, and I want to discuss a lot of things about that book with him here in this podcast. Before I get there, most of us play games but never considered them as a piece of art. Yet, as T argues, good games are works of art, but in a very specific way. What games are and how they are like art is something we'll discuss. Another thing we'll discuss is system inspired by games. T calls them game like systems, and they are also popularly known as gamified things, which present us with some scores to optimize. Think of it as 10,000 steps in your Fitbit or your Twitter account. It's fun to see these numbers go up, but as T argues, this is precisely what makes these systems a danger to our society. So, how gamification backfires is another second big thing that I want to get into. So, okay, enough of me talking. Welcome to the podcast, T.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here.
Great. So, I want to spend most of our time talking about your recent ideas on, say, dangers of simplifications
Yeah.
presented by gamified systems, but wanted to set the background. I'll let you set the background in any way you want to, but mostly maybe talk about how do you define games and also why do we like playing games?
So yeah, I've been a game player most of my life, and I started writing this book. So I think you're shocked. I also shocked. I'm shocked to be doing philosophy of games. This is not something that I thought. I was trained as a very traditional philosopher, studying the nature of knowledge and the nature of ethics, and I got on this odd side project because I was teaching a class. I decided to do a case study about video games as an art form. And I found that a lot of the stuff I was reading didn't seem to get at the heart of what made games special to me. So I've been playing video games, computer games, board games, role-playing games. I've been playing everything for my entire life. And many of the theories that were out there tended to talk about games as if they were just a type of movie or a type of story. They emphasized what we knew were already there, which we already knew were a good part of art, right? Dialogue, story, character, script, visuals. But they wouldn't talk about the action, the decision, the skill, the difficulty, which seems the distinctively game-like part. So I was trying to understand this, and I was reading around, and I found two things that really helped. One was a book by a philosopher named Bernard Suits, who wrote a classic in the 70s called The Grasshopper about games and what games are. And he gives this incredible definition of a game that I think is basically right and is the center of what I've done. So he says that what it is to play a game is to voluntarily take on unnecessary obstacles in order to create the possibility of struggling against them. So I'll say that again. What it is to play a game is to voluntarily take on unnecessary obstacles to create the possibility of struggling against them. So what he means is, there are details, but the short way is to put it is that in the games, the obstacles are necessary to the point. They're a necessary part of what you're doing. One of the ways he puts it is something like, look, if I just wanted to be at a particular place in the city, and all that mattered to me was like to get there, to get food or to meet someone, I would take the most efficient path there, right? I would take a car, a bicycle, a bus, whatever got me there as quickly and cheaply as possible. But if running a marathon, I don't do that, right? When I'm running a marathon, I put a limit on myself. I don't take shortcuts, and I run. I can't take, right? And the point of what he's saying, and I think everyone intuitively knows this, is that if you're running a marathon and you take a car, you haven't even run the marathon, right? You haven't crossed the finish line. It doesn't count. So unlike a lot of other life where the point is to efficiently get things, the point of a game is actually to be stuck in the inefficiency. So the fast way of putting it is in games, the struggle is necessary to the point. The difficulty is
Right.
necessary to the
So
point.
rules are essential to
Yeah.
what things are called as games. But it's interesting. Certain types of rules we enjoy overcoming, and we enter into struggle with those rules voluntarily. But there are certain rules which we don't enjoy at all. Like we won't necessarily enjoy a bureaucratic
Right.
process where there's so many rules. So what's your thought on what makes certain kinds of rules fun, and we call
Right.
them as games, but other rules are simply chores?
So the answer to that is kind of complicated. I think that some rule sets create constraints.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the question is, I don't think there's a general theory, but bureaucratic rule sets aren't designed for fun and pleasure, and games are designed for fun and pleasure. So, I mean, I think I'm enmeshed in bureaucracies too. I'm in a university, and the reason you put the rules there, we know what they are. Either it's like a constraint about fairness or a political fight, and you agree on this rule because it's the one thing you can agree on, or there's someone's worried about a lawsuit. So the pressures generating the rules aren't pressures towards beauty, pleasure, fun. With game design, it's completely the opposite, right? With game design, you put in a rule and then you play it and then you ask what effect you're trying to get. Is it fun? Is it interesting? And then if it isn't getting that effect, you tweak the rules for the effect. So the larger one thing is just to say that rules in games have been designed for pleasure or fun or interest. I think the other thing that's really interesting is that not everyone likes every game, and games that I play complex investment games that are torture for other people, and other people play games that I find either like boring or torture, right? So there are different kinds of games that people enjoy. And the thing about games, the things that's crucial in Suits' account is they're voluntary. You can choose the game that fits you. And there's a whole variety out there. I mean, I find running really boring and rock climbing really interesting. I tried running, and when it didn't fit me, I got to move. The thing about bureaucratic rules is usually you're stuck in them, right? You don't get a choice. You can't easily be like, well, my university's rule set is is boring. I'll hop universities. We can't do that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Chores are something that are imposed upon you. You're not choosing them, but the rules of the games that you're voluntarily sort of engaging in. Another perspective that I've been pondering upon is really how much of this safety aspect of games helps you. I mean, in most of the games, they are isolated from the real world. There are no real world consequences. But if the rules that you play with, say, in bureaucracy, the real world consequences of getting it right and wrong. And that puts a lot of stress and pressure and makes things less fun.
So I think there's a standard view that says something like the reason games are more fun is that they're safer. I can see that in many circumstances. And there are many cases where the safety permits something, but I think I part ways from that. I think it's partly because I'm a rock climber and a backpacker, right? And I think that like that model of games is essentially safe is built on board games and card games and these things that you can stop in a moment. But for me, so one of the things that fits, so Suit says you're putting up obstacles for pleasure, and those obstacles aren't necessarily things you can take away in an instant. If you're backpacking, you've taken on an obstacle for the struggle, right? But if you're out there 5 days away from civilization, I mean, something goes wrong. That's definitely the struggle you asked for, right? The same thing for rock climbers. Like there's a part of rock climbing where actually so I boulder a lot, but even though you're not that high, so boulders often go up 20 feet without a rope. When you're at 20 feet over a small pad, there's an attunement and a focus that comes from, if you slip at the top, it's going to hurt hard and it might break something. And like, I think for a lot of rock climbers, that degree of danger, I mean, there's a weird flip. I think that there are a lot of people for whom there are many cases where these engagements we have with games are really safe, and that's why I want them. But for other people, I feel like they'll say things like, well, I work my entire life in this controlled office environment and everything is air conditioned, comfortable, and I get whatever I want. And I like, so many backpackers say this, I like being out there where my survival is my responsibility. And if I fuck up, I'm going to die. And so that's an obstacle you can take on where the danger is actually a key part. So I think the more you think about certain sports, right?
Yeah. I mean,
especially really intense sports.
I've never done rock climbing, but
Yeah.
whenever I see someone doing it, I always think, why would anyone in their right mind take
Yeah.
that challenge of climbing without ropes? But I can see that that's part of the challenge you've taken up voluntarily. I think what you alluded to earlier was games are these systems where the rules are tweaked, I think iterated upon over a period of time so that they give maximum pleasure. But in the other systems, I think rules are incidental to getting a specific end met. It's not optimized for pleasure.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, so I was saying you alluded to the games, the rules generating fun in a very intentional way. So perhaps
Yeah.
if we think of it as an evolutionary process,
Right.
rules are optimized one by one to see what gets the most pleasure. But in other systems, rules are perhaps just incidental to getting something done.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think this is, well, I mean, there's a few different non-game rule systems. So one non-game rule system is like, I would think like, look, there's something you want, and then there's some rules that are incidental to that, but are required, like moral rules, right? So a lot of the times you might think, look, what I want is to take what I want is to eat something delicious, but there are external constraints. I just can't take it away from somebody else, right? So that in some sense incidental. There are other systems where I feel like there are rules, but the rules are help you get the thing you want, but they're rules kind of imposed by the world, right? Like if you want, like for me in my job, if I want to be a philosopher, I have to grade a lot of papers, right? That is the arrangement the world offers me, and I'm kind of forced to do that. The way to think about games, I think, is that games are interesting because the constraints are actually the thing you want. Like they're directly the thing you want, right? It's the constraints themselves. They're not just instrumental to this other thing. It's that what I want, the constraints in rock climbing force me to be moving up by my hands and feet. And the whole point, what Suits is showing is rock climbing, what it is to want to be a rock climber is to want to move up with your hands and feet, right?
Right. So
if someone offers you a
rock
lift to the
climbing
top,
is not just getting on top of the rock, but actually getting on top of the rock with those certain constraints, and
right?
the joy is in the constraints
Right.
themselves.
One way to put it is, I think the constraints shape an activity, and the thing you want is not the outcome of the activity, but the constraint shaped activity itself. Like you want to run a marathon because you want to be running, right?
Yeah. You also write, I was going through the book summary page on your website, and you write about what games teach us about ourselves. And one line really struck me where you talked about stupid drinking games are incredibly important to understanding the nature of our rationality and agency.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that?
Right. So for me, there's a distinction between two motivations for play. So there's achievement play and striving play. Mm-hmm. So achievement play is playing because you want to win at that game, right? So you play because you want to be the best mountain climber, right? The top poker player. You want to have victory. The other thing you can do, striving play, is to temporarily get interested in winning because of the struggle. But in striving play, you're not actually really interested in winning. So I think there are a lot of reasons to think that striving play is real. So I give two examples in the book. So one example is, so my wife and I play a lot of board games, and sometimes we'll find one and we're just perfectly balanced. So we have very different, like I'm better at social manipulation. She's a chemist. She's better at geometrical manipulation and seeing spatial relationships. So a lot of games, either one of us is just better than the other. But sometimes we find a game where those skills are balanced, and it's great. And then I'll find a strategy guide at night. And I think to myself, right? I think if I read the strategy guide, I'm just going to win.
Yeah.
But I don't read the strategy guide, right? So does that make sense?
Yeah.
So even though to play that game in the moment, I have to be trying to win, you can tell that I don't actually care about winning because I don't take steps to make myself better, because that would make the struggle less interesting. I think you can particularly see this in party games. So a lot of party games are just dumb activities like charades. Imagine someone like studying YouTube videos to be the best charades player, right? I think you immediately know this is the thing that I think is most philosophically interesting in the games book. That even though to play charades you have to be trying hard to win, it's not fun unless it's like that. We know there's something deeply wrong with a person that studies in their after hours, like optimized charade strategy to win as much as possible. Because I think you know in your heart that winning isn't the point, right?
Yeah.
The fun struggle is. And for me, drinking games are actually the clearest example of this. So I introduced this category in the book I call stupid games. And a stupid game is a game where the fun part is failing, but it's only fun if you actually try to win. So the weird paradox of a game like Twister or a drinking game is that everyone knows the point of the game is that people fail and everyone laughs together, and that's the fun part. But if you fail on purpose, it's not funny. So the weird structure of a stupid game is you have to get yourself to try to win, even though what you want is to fail. So for me, that exposes this very weird, playful, fluid part of our personality, of what humans are capable of, which is getting ourselves to try really hard to win, even though that's not what we care about galactically at all.
Yeah. Do you think it's to do with I mean, I see what you're talking about, that if someone fails on purpose in a party game, that's boring. But also if someone purposely wants to win at it, tries really hard, that's also not so interesting, because it takes the fun out of it. I know how would you put it, but is it really we're trying to assess our natural abilities, where we want people not to try too hard or not try at all, give it their honest shot?
Yeah. So what's interesting is I think a lot of party games like charades do have this design feature where it seems to work only if people in the right spirit. They're trying and they're not trying too hard.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things so I think there are a lot of game designs that are fragile in a particular way, that they demand people be playing in the same spirit, right? Like I think a lot of the kind of really geeky war games I grew up playing, everyone has to be playing really hard. Or like chess. If someone's just like screwing around, chess is not fun. One of the interesting things about, I think, the modern German and Euro game board game world was that they were very specifically designing games for family environments where some people were very competitive and some people weren't. And a lot of those designs are interesting because you can actually have half the people screwing around and not trying that hard, and the other half the people trying super hard, and the game doesn't fall apart. So my sense has been that that's not a necessary feature of games. It's a design feature, and that some games do have a certain fragility where people have to be playing in the right mood. And a lot of the times those are more free-for games. So for example, I play a lot of tabletop role-playing games, and those are incredibly creative. But because they're so unstructured, they do require people to be playing in the right mood, where like everyone has to be kind of like in the same, we're going to be telling the story. No one's trying too hard to win, right? You're all kind of invested in the story. The European board games that make it possible for people to, like some people to be really aggressive and some people that are not, are really controlled environments where there's not a huge option space and you can't be that creative. And so that kind of controls people's actions in a way so that they can interact usefully.
Do you have examples of such games?
Yeah, there's just tons of so, I mean, the one that everyone knows is Settlers of Catan, even though I don't like Settlers of Catan that much. But games like the old school games like El Grande and Ra, and Reiner Knizia is this incredible game designer. He has a lot of games like Modern Art, Samurai. And then later on, I think Hansa Teutonica is a great... So I got to watch this this is one of the things that got me really excited. I played a lot of board games as a kid, but they were either classical abstract games like chess or Go, or these super geeky war games that like you would only play if you were super invested in learning like a 50-page rule book, or these family games like Monopoly that are just dumb and terrible. And kind of in the late 80s, early 90s, at least in America, we got this influx of these game designs coming in mostly from Germany, and they were different. They were designed for families. They were easy to learn, but they were strategically deep. If you're interested, on my website, objectionable.net, I have a recommended board games list where I have about 30 games, and most of them are this kind. And a lot of them are these interesting games where you don't conflict directly, but you like are manipulating some kind of simple stock market to build your own resource, your own resource engine, and they work really well. And I play them a ton, and it is, but I think it's like a piece of design brilliance that makes the better ones able to take people with different spirits of play. And you'll notice that a lot of the drinking games that don't have this are super simple, right? Like they're just, here's 3 rules, now go. And you all kind of have to be in the right spirit or it doesn't work.
Yeah, I think this is a great segue to the next question I had, which is whether game design is a science or an art form. So do you think we understand what makes good games fun well enough that we can derive a science out of it, or is it mostly or largely a work of art?
Right. So there's a straightforward way for me to answer this in a meta way, because I actually have been writing papers about the difference between art and science as a way of life.
Let's get into it.
Okay. So, but one thing I can say is, so I teach, one of the reasons I'm at University of Utah is it has one of the world's top game design programs. So I teach game designers. Like I have a yearly aesthetics and philosophy of design class where you design games. And I can say right now, 100% it's an art form. It is, there's no good way to create a simple principled rule set to create good games. You can create formulaic games, like, but that's, I mean, in the same way that people will complain, like, yeah, you know, Marvel movies are good, they're fun, but they're always kind of the same. People, you know, they have this formulaic feel where you know exactly the mood, you know exactly the beat, and you can enjoy yourself. I enjoy them all, but I know that like they're not trying for something unexpected that involves some kind of deep creativity. Game design is like that. Like there's the same thing where a lot of AAA games have the feel of blockbusters. They are designed by a formula. People are trying to get them through focus groups, and they're really like, they have good graphics, but they're really kind of uncreative. They're not amazing, right? And a lot, the amazingness in games, the games that like people that are the aficionados really get into, tend to be games that are it's like it feels like art. It's like there's an indie world where there are people trying out weird things, and they're creatives like experimenting around and seeing how things go. And so it has that feel of like a world. One of the distinctive claims in the philosophy of art has always been that art, one of the things that differs between art and science is that there aren't clear principles for what makes something good art, both on the appreciation side and on the creation side. That every attempt to do that has failed and creates this kind of generic formulaic art.
Right. Yeah. But it's fascinating that, I mean, even if we can't put a finger onto what makes something a good art piece, I think the general consensus emerges. I mean, you can at least put things into 2 baskets. What is good art, bad art, good game, bad game. So obviously,
you're not talking to the same people I am.
So do you feel art is 100% entirely subjective?
No, but I think there's a lot of, so my friend Matt Stroll, he has this great piece called Against Rotten Tomatoes. And one of the things he says is, one of the problems with Rotten Tomatoes is that really great art is typically controversial. Like the stuff, like if you ask people what they love, you'll often see these things where some figure like David Lynch will be incredible. And like some people love him and some people are like, oh, that's weird junk. And the stuff that everyone agrees on is kind of, again, the kind of, everyone agrees that, you know, Marvel's Endeavour 1 was a lot of fun. Yeah. I think very like no film people think that's the greatest artwork ever, but so kind of like mid-level, like pleasant stuff everyone kind of agrees on, and then like the exciting stuff you get like mass disagreement. Like so like same thing in music. Like
I'm not talking about Marvel. I think everyone probably knows Marvel is not art, but if there is sort of like an art piece where at least there's consensus, there's an attempt to make art,
Yeah, so there's a consensus. There's a lot of consensus about whether something is art, but there's not a huge amount of consensus about whether it's good art. Often, especially recently. Sorry, this is like you're the question you're asking about the objectivity of art is something that I literally teach year-long graduate seminars on.
Right.
This is a whole like 50-hour conversation of like enormous
so what's the
complexity.
TLDR? I mean, obviously, you have thought tons and tons about it, but if someone like me or the audience has to think about like what's a good art, or is it even the right question to ask? What's your recommendation?
Right. So there are a few things to say. One of my favorite distinctions is an old distinction in the philosophy of art from Richard Wollheim that I'm really tempted by, where he says the difference between art and craft is that craft is the practice where we know ahead of time what we're aiming for, and people know what they're going to get out of it when they go. Right. That, if you make a chair, right, you know what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to support you. If you make a knife, you know what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to cut things, right? And when people go buy a knife, they know exactly what they want. So Oldham thought that art was distinctive because it's the realm where you don't know going in. An artist going in doesn't know what's going to happen from their novel. They find out in the process whether it's and you'll read this all the time. Like artists will be telling the story and they thought it was like a happy story, but it turns out to be sad, or it turns out to articulate some emotion in a new way. They thought as appreciators, what we do when we go to art is we have a basically different attitude where we're not just using it to get to a particular emotion. So he thought that like one way to put it is the thing about pornography and sentimentality is that you go to it knowing you want this feeling, and the thing gives you that feeling. You're like, done, I'm out. Where with art, he thought, you're going to it not knowing what it will give you and being open to being surprised by a thing being beautiful in a new way, surprising in a way, moving in a new way. So a phrase that some people have about this is that that aesthetic concepts have an open texture, right? Like things that are beautiful can be beautiful in new ways that surprise you. So when you ask me, if you believe something like that, and you ask me, okay, what makes something good art? My answer is, I can't tell you by definition. The essence of art is that it's surprising. And this, I think, gives you sort of an answer to the science question, right? Like the claim is that there's a solution or a feeling that I can optimize for. It's that the whole point of what art is it's a place in our human life where we can discover new experiences, new relationships, new emotions. And a lot of my favorite games do this, where I go and I have an experience that I never knew I could have. I would never have looked for it ahead of time because I didn't know I could have that experience.
Got it. So this surprising beauty that you're talking about, you're talking in context of as a consumer of art or even as a creator of art, you have no idea what you'll end up creating.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that you have no idea, but you're open to newness, right? You're open to it. You're open to it.
So there is there's no instrumentality that you're creating for a specific end.
There's no tight instrumentality. There's not a well-defined outcome that you're optimizing for. It's that you have an openness. I mean, this is just one theory, but it's one I particularly I have a lot of affection for.
Got it. Got it. So turning to the part of the podcast, which is game-like systems, can you talk about how games are different from game-like systems and why are latter dangerous while former isn't? I think you call it value capture in one of your papers.
So I'm really worried about things like, so a lot of people in this space think games are great, so gamification is great. If you love games are playful. Right. Gamification makes life more like, so Jane McGonigal famously defends the claim that gamification makes life more like a game. So it makes life more fun. And so it turns grindy activities more fun. And so we should do it. I am strongly against that view. And I think if you actually understand what makes games great, and in particular, if you understand what makes play great, you'll understand the worries about gamifying real life activities. So let me go back to games for a second. I want to really characterize what's special about games. So one thing about games, as we noted several times, is that they're voluntary. You get to choose them. And another is that they end. So there's this old claim that the games occur in a magic circle, where there's this special separate moment or space that you enter into and you pull back from. So the original people that were talking about this were interested in the fact that our relationships and our goals change in a game, right? Like, so for example, again, my wife and I, we love each other, we support each other. And if we are playing basketball and we're different teams, that's all off, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Imagine what would happen if I threw the ball to my wife who is on the other team because no, you don't fucking do that. And imagine what would happen if afterwards I was angrier and I was like, how could you block my pass? We don't do that because games are a separate space. And the really interesting thing about games is that they end. You can step back from them and you can be like, okay, we put away those goals now. We're stopping doing that. Even the games I was talking about, like backpacking or rock climbing, even though you're putting, some part of your health and body on the line, it stops. It's over. You put them away. So one of the things I think that makes games really valuable is that the experience of valuing and goals in games is incredibly clear, right? In normal life, things are super complicated. Values are complicated. What we're supposed to be doing is complicated. But in games, you get to know exactly what counts as winning and have this temporary experience of being completely absorbed in pure, simple purpose, right?
Yeah.
But that's safe in a game because it's separate. Like, it doesn't matter that basketball points are so simple because you stop playing basketball at some point, right? They don't correspond to something in reality.
Yeah. You essentially enter into an alternate universe when you play games.
You enter into an alternate universe with an alternate point structure and an alternate motivational structure.
Okay.
Right. Reiner Knizia, my favorite game designer, said the points tell the players what to want. They set the desires for the players. They're these, like, they give players desires. And that's great in a game because that's not your life, right? There's something, one way to put it is, it would be really creepy for me to incept into you desires for your whole life, giving you the option to temporarily take on a desire for a while and then step back from it and decide whether you want to do that again. That's not at all creepy because it's under your voluntary control. So one way to put the big worry, there are two worries. One is, in many cases of gamification, it's not like, I'm in the educational system. People are talking about gamifying grades. That's not something students can opt out of, right? That's not something students can step around. So I think the fact that it's non-voluntary and intrusive makes it more like mind control. One way you can put it is that the technology of games is a technology of alternate experiences of motivation. If it's voluntary, awesome, you're controlling your motivational set. If it's non-voluntary, then someone is, and this is what like the educational environment can feel like. Suddenly, everybody's getting sucked into just caring about their grades. Right. That's the first worry. The second worry is that game points are the thing that gives you pleasure in games, that the game points are simple, but that's okay in a game because they're not simplifying anything real, right? There's not a real thing the basketball points are simplifying. In Twitter, if you get motivated by the Twitter points, that is simplifying something real. That's your motivation for communication. A GPA is simplifying something real. That's your motivation for an education, right? Education is much more complicated than the GPA. Communication is much more complicated than how many likes you got. Right. And so because the point systems are occupying real activities, when they displace the values of those activities, they simplify the activities. I think Twitter is the easiest example. The gamification of Twitter turns the complex process of communication into a simple competition for popularity.
Right. So on both of these points, how do you contrast game-like systems with things like mass media, where I think both of these issues are still present? They can be imposed from the outside. The kinds of movies, say Hollywood ends up produces, the choice in certain production studios, they can end up influencing how the mass society thinks. And similarly, the values that you're able to communicate may be also simplified. So have you thought about this? Is it unique to games or is it more pervasive?
So I would say that there are many forms of value simplification. So I actually have a paper about this, called Seductions of Clarity, where I say something like, look, the clarity of game point systems is just one way to get there, right? Another is, like, I think conspiracy theories are another way to get there, and there are a lot of moral systems that, even though they're not point-like, are simplifying things, and that's sort of the unifying pleasure. But, like, games are like the most potent. It's like the heroin of value simplification, right?
Yeah.
It's not just a simple set of words. It's the reduction to a point-wise system where every step is clear and every time you've gotten a success, right?
Right. I think
everything is measured and quantized. So
yeah.
it's the extreme point of that.
Yeah. I think perhaps the biggest risk is that we don't even know what games we are playing or the society is making us play. When you say Twitter as a game, GP as a game, I'm pretty sure most of the people listening to this, this would be perhaps the first time they would have thought of these systems as games. So what are your thoughts on that? Do we recognize the games we are in?
I think so. One of the things that got me to write my book, I'm writing a popular book next about this stuff. I got a letter from an undergraduate, and she said that she'd heard a talk about the same stuff we're talking about today, games and gamification. And she said it pulled her out of 5 years of depression because she realized that she'd been stuck in bad games that she didn't realize were bad games. What she said was, she's given me permission to tell the story. I'm going to tell her the story in the book. So she was, like me, first generation child of Asian American immigrants, pushed to get top grades, and an athlete pushed to do well in a sport she wasn't even sure she liked, and anorexic and obsessed with her weight. And she realized that these were bad games. She said she hadn't even realized that. So I've heard this. So when I wrote this, BMI and anorexia weren't on my mind because that's not part of the world I'm in. I was really thinking about Twitter. But one of the most common bits of feedback I've given from this material is mostly women telling me that this explains their experience of certain circles that are very anorexia supporting as kind of bad competitive games built around a clear ranking system. In this case, how skinny you are, right? What your BMI is. And that what they told me was there's something incredibly valuable about realizing they're trapped in a bad game.
Mm-hmm.
I also find this with students. Like some of my students have this moment where they're like, oh my God, I never realized, but GPA is a bad game. Like I could I don't just have to take this as the only goal of my life. I can step back away from it and realize, well, a lot of people are paying attention to it, but I don't have to care about this with every inch of my soul if I think other things are more valuable. So I do think there's this insight where you can realize that you've been competing on a clear metric, and that part of the reason you're doing that is that metric is so clear, even though you don't like that activity. Mm-hmm. I think part of the danger here is what makes real games good when you approach them well is you have a certain degree of control. You play it and then you step back from it and you ask yourself, was that playing worthwhile? But if you get sucked into it, you don't have that reflective step.
Right. So on this note, it's not just because these metrics are clear, right? There is a certain degree of value to these metrics, why society has sort of picked on them or chosen them. So I don't think the right idea would be to abandon these metrics altogether. And one of the things we were discussing before the podcast, what's the practical advice to really balance? Because GPA is obviously good, but GPA exclusively can be harmful. Right. And similarly, I think abandoning the idea of having a healthy weight can be quite risky. So it's easy to sort of swing both ways, caring too much versus caring not at all about certain clear metrics. How do you think about it? What's your advice there?
So one thing is, GPA is a really interesting one because we all know the instrumental use of it. It's connected to job use. So, socially, I do think that we should de-emphasize. Like, I try to de-emphasize grading in my classes because I know the more pervasive I make it, the more intrusive it is. But at some point, you have to acknowledge, like, look, this is what people are being judged on. But I think there's a deep difference between knowing that you'll be judged on something and so using it as an instrumental resource versus thinking this is all there is. And I think one of the big differences, if you know it's an instrumental resource, you can trade it off against your other values. I think the easiest way to think about this is money. I think one thing to think is, here's what a good life is for me. And to get that, I need a certain amount of money. Right?
Yeah.
And but the goal of that money is to get a good life. And there's a totally different thing to think my point in life is to make as much money as possible. And I think down that road lies being a stressed out, friendless, lonely, angry person that is just optimized for money and nothing else. Right. And I think that's, there's also like, I think there's a huge difference between thinking I'm going to make money in order to improve the world and thinking I'm just going to make as much money as possible. With the weight stuff, I'm actually quite worried that there's been an overall society-wide capture by thinking of low weight as the primary metric for health. It's very easy, right? It's a really easy one to measure. But compared to other things like activity, mobility, right? I think I do think there's been this social-wide capture where if you look at someone that's, I think most of the people I know, if you would look at someone skinny who never left their desk, who dieted all the time, who couldn't really lift anything, and think that person, right, is healthy. And society-wide, most people would look at someone that was fat. And so I know people, they're fat, they weight lift, they do MMA, they hike, they do yoga, they're very mobile, they're very strong, their joints are good, right? They can do all kinds of shit. And most people would look at that and think unhealthy. And I think that's because there's been a society-wide capture by this very simple metric of weight instead of this much more complicated concept of like health and fitness.
Right. I think everyone would agree what ultimately matters are these things like health and good life, which are very hard to define. And things like, say, weight are a proxy to that. Obviously, if someone singularly optimizes those proxies, they do it at expense of so many other things that go into these final things that matter, which is health and good life. And that's the point you're making, right?
Yep. It's not, I'm not saying GPA has no correlation to education, right? Like I'm an educator. I give A's to students that have learned more, but I think like it's a very, very rough proxy that's subject to all kinds of gaming. Among other things, you can get a high GPA by taking easy classes that don't teach you anything, right? So I'm not saying that if I saw someone, a straight A student and a straight F student, I would have some information, but also, right, it's not, I think a lot about students that take easier, who will say things like, well, this class is more interesting and I care about it. And it's like really valuable, but it's hard and I'm not sure I can get an A. So I need to protect my grade point average by taking this class that I know is boring, where I'm not going to learn something, but I'm sure I can get an A, right? That's the kind of optimizing where the thinness of the metric and the information loss of the metric leads to major problems. So a lot of the metrics contain some information, and they're usable when we treat them as knowingly treat them as thin, rough indicators. But that's not the same as like obsessing them as the center of what you care about.
Have you thought about why this metrification or simplification is so seductive? What is it about human mind or our society that we tend to gravitate and put everything into neat little boxes that can be measured?
I don't. So one thing that's interesting to me is I think this is just I think that's kind of not my turf. I'm a philosopher, not an empiricist, and that's an empirical psychological question. I found it interesting that not a lot of psychologists have studied exactly that. There is something called the need for clarity, about the desire to have things clear and not be ambiguous. I've actually been in a bunch of rooms. So one of the things I say at the end of the games book is that I'm not worried about games making people violent, but I am worried that games make people more seducible by clear metrified value systems. And that hasn't really been studied a lot. So I've been asking psychologists to study it. And I've at least gotten a few people to take the bait and maybe start studying it. One thing I can say is that, it seems, so there's some empirical literature from anthropology and sociology about it. And I think one thing is that it improves our sense of certainty and confidence, and it can also improve one's sense of power, right? So the certainty is something like, well, you know exactly where you stand. You know exactly the conditions that would make you get better. So insofar as uncertainty or ambiguity is uncomfortable, that seems satisfying. And it can seem powerful because, I mean, I was thinking about this in this paper, Seductions of Clarity, about like why conspiracy theories make you feel powerful. Conspiracy theories make you transform you from being like, I don't know why the world it is, it's complicated, to saying like, I can explain everything. And I think a certain metrified thing, instead of having to say something like, I look at this all the time on Twitter, in this, I think I spend a lot of time on Twitter watching this war between a very outcomes oriented world and this like the world I live in, where people are like, values are more complicated and looser. And I think there's a similar power where I have to say something like, I don't know, values are complicated. You have to figure something out yourself. And someone who believes with all their heart that making money is the one value, can say something like, look, I did this, I improved, I can be completely sure, I'm more productive, I've done something with, like, the sense of agency is tighter and clearer if you simplify and publify, right?
Yeah.
One of the things about metrics is that they're very public.
Yeah, I think, very simple example, if there are two scientists and one scientist talking about health is really hard to measure, 10 different things, 100 different things, I can't tell you whether you're healthy or not. Someone else says you walk 10,000 steps and you'll be healthy. I think the mere sort of communication of a simple idea gives just automatic fake credibility that the latter scientist must be knowing something the former doesn't.
Yep. I mean, there's something like, one of the things that I've been doing a lot of research on lately is the history of what's hard to measure, the theory about what's hard to measure at institutional scale. And so you can get really, for example, I'm really worried right now that the entire practice of medicine is also captured in a certain way by being very invested in very easy to measure qualities like saving lives and extending life. And so well-being is really hard to measure. There's a really great book on it from a philosopher of medicine, Anna Alexandrova. And one of the things she ends up saying is like, there's small local well-being measures that people will believe in for particular situations, like monitoring the well-being of kids in foster care in New York who are teenagers. But large-scale well-being measures, there are none that people really believe in. And so I kind of think there are certain things that are easier to measure and other things that are important that are harder to measure. And the things that are easier to measure often win out in cultural conversations just because it's easy to say like, this will make people live longer. I mean, they might be sadder and more miserable and feel less creative, but like, we can't measure that stuff. So that doesn't have as much social power. That's something I'm really worried about right now.
Right. As you were talking about, I'm pretty sure you would have read this book, Seeing Like a State. It just, this book just kept on coming to my mind, where they talk about how governments and states have this drive to make everything legible. And legibility in this context means that they need to measure anything, and everything revolves around their requirement to maybe record and communicate. And that simplifies everything, right? So
Seeing Like a State, so it's the stuff that I'm writing right now, Seeing Like a State is really the center of it, and there's more. So if you're interested in Seeing Like a State from James Scott, you should also read Theodore Porter's Trust in Numbers, and then Jeffrey Bowker and Susan Lee Starr's Sorting Things Out, History of Standardization and Its Consequences. And then this new book from Lorraine Daston about rules and the history of rules. And I mean, Scott is kind of, I teach Scott first, but all of these people help clarify for me this vision of what large-scale states and institutions do, which is prefer qualities that are easily measured and aggregated at scale.
Right.
That's much of what I've been thinking about. And I think one of the ways to put what I've been working on is Scott, in Seeing Like a State, is really interested in how states make externalities more legible. They make agriculture more legible. They make cities more legible. They make the land ownership laws more legible. And I've been describing my own project as showing that James Scott also applies to our soul, like our values and our cares. The state would also prefer for our values to be more legible, and our values would be more legible if we all cared about money and GPA, and it's much more illegible if we care about weird, janky junk like beauty and creativity and like intimacy.
And states do that by designing rules and laws that ultimately impact the way we look at our own lives.
I mean, so it's really complicated to say how it works. With in Scott, some of it is rules and laws, and one of the things that's interesting in Scott is he also just talks about the state reordering physical like material reality. So Scott thinks that the movement from cities being complex sprawls of small streets that to like these big easy grids is that the small streets often create this like warmer, richer, more organic life. Every time I move from like, I live in like a pure grid city, and every time I'm in like, I don't know, like Eastern Europe, like I was in Istanbul, which is this, you know, incredibly complicated old school city with, and it feels wonderful. It feels human scaled, right? Walking around, finding new corners. Grids are more legible to the state because it is easier for a large scale bureaucracy to, I mean, what he thought was it's easier for a large scale bureaucracy to put together an army of people from anywhere and tell them to go to certain places because you don't need a lot of local knowledge to navigate the space. So he thinks that the way that a state wants to run agriculture is instead of having different farmers be responsive to very different microclimates, you try to even out the soil and make it all the same using fertilizers, and then plant crops that have been engineered to behave the same way. So that's how the state deals with material reality.
Right.
I think that the gamification stuff I'm talking about, what I want to suggest is the state's way of getting us to believe in the same kinds of things, using psychological levers. I don't know exactly why it works in our soul, to your question, but we kind of know it exists, right? Every sociologist who's in the space is like, whenever you put human beings near a metric system, they just orient towards it, like fish orienting to current. We just go.
Right. Is there any way to get this right, especially in game-like systems? I don't know, I mean, whether it's even possible to not try to sort of squeeze a complex system into simple metrics. But have you seen any game-like system done right?
I mean, what I kind of think is that the nature of a game-like system so yes, actually, let me give you an answer, but I don't know how well we can make it into a policy. So the game-like systems I'm the most worried about being exported to the world are the ones that look like these clear point systems. There are other game activities that don't look like that at all. So I think, like, for example, a lot of tabletop role-playing games aren't games where people are hyper-oriented towards a point system. You can build them so people are more interested in so the game points you to these kind of creative acts of like storytelling that are unrelated to the points. So if you could build that kind of system, if you could design that, and I think like some people, so like if you look at the literature on ungrading, which is about building classroom structures where you don't put a single clear quantified letter grade at the middle, where you de-emphasize it or remove it, then you have systems and structures that encourage people to do activities that aren't hyper focused. So maybe that's game-like in a different way. But if you're asking me if I've seen a system in which there's a clear point system at the center that resists its pointness, I think that's the point where we're talking about like the essential tension between point systems and ambiguity and complexity.
Right. I think it's a good frame to think about the differentiation between optimizing points and perhaps an exploration of open creativity. And games can enable both. I mean, Minecraft, you can optimize for survival mode, but you have an open world to create whatever you want to create. And I think that's a good frame to think about. And perhaps we should be doing the latter more than the former.
I think actually, I think we're getting close to the end. I have a grand finale for you.
Okay.
Are you ready? So there's this relationship between the notion of games and play. So, and Bernard Suits, I think, really helpfully points out that there are different concepts. Right? You can play without games. You can just screw around, and you can also work at a game. If you hate poker but you make money on it and you're doing it just to make money, that's your job, but it's still a game. And I think what it is to be playful it's kind of a hard concept to track, but a lot of people think it's to like move easily between different value systems, to not be locked in, to not be stuck, to be able to like shift around and have some freedom in what you care about. And I think actual games, real games, because you can step in and out of them, really encourage playfulness. My worry is that gamified point systems in the world as we see them are the opposite of play, right? Being locked and having your entire educational experience structured to get you to lock in on GPA as your motivation system is the opposite of play.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to sum up the difference between optimizing towards a certain system versus maybe getting inspired by a system to explore the potential our lives have.
Exactly.
Great. So I don't know how much more time you have. I have just one last question. Love to get into it. So I was thinking, you do a lot of thinking around this, but I was curious how it has impacted your own life. Have you intentionally changed anything in your life based on how you think about games or games-like system?
Yeah, I mean, among other things have happened. Once in a while, I'll go viral on Twitter, and then I can feel myself getting so excited by the point system that I have to delete Twitter for a while. I mean, let's just be clear. I write about this from the place of a person that's pretty easily addicted to point systems. But I find it just articulating it. I mean, I can look. I recently got a couple of job offers from universities that are higher ranked than the one I'm at. Mm-hmm. I happen to love the place I'm at, and I think it's the perfect place for me because I have this connection to this game design program. But it's not high. There's a ranking of philosophy departments that the philosophy world creates, right? And I think a lot of us are brought up to automatically think what I should do with my career is move up that ranking. And it was really hard for me. And I think to make the choice of saying something like, look, I think where I'm at and what I'm doing is better, makes me happier, is more important, is a better fit, even though it doesn't look as highly ranked on the system. And now here's a job offer that would give me a higher ranking. And I think having articulated this stuff to myself made it much easier for me to say, like, no, that's just a ranking. Like, that's not that is a fairly artificial, simplified construct that doesn't take into account all the rich information about my life. And so I can say, screw it.
Philosophy was perhaps the last department I thought it will have a ranking.
I talk about this a lot when I talk to philosophers. The irony is you would think that philosophers would not be like this, but philosophers, just as much as anybody else, just their internal ranking systems, and they just orient.
It's like a doctor smoking, which happens all the time. So
yeah, right.
I understand this. So Thi, if you have time, you also talked about experts, and maybe that's the last thing we can get into, which is reliance on experts or how it changes when we ask them to simplify things for us. So maybe you can expand on that. But the question I had was, we live in a world of specialization. So we have to deal with, as lay people, we have to deal with experts all the time. And experts can have all sorts of biases and motivations. So what's the prescriptive advice you have on dealing with experts? For example, should we ever cross-question a doctor? And what should those questions be like?
Right. So this is one of the things this is on a slightly different side of my work. So half of my work is in this game stuff. The other half is about this puzzle about how you identify experts. There's actually an interesting way that I'm finding those two parts colliding now. So I think there's a basic way to describe the character of our life now in the modern era that's completely different from how humanity has been, which is basically past the Enlightenment. Human knowledge has grown too large for a human being, right? So one of my favorite philosophers, Elijah Milgram, has this way of looking at it where he says, the Great Enlightenment introduced this notion of intellectual autonomy. Like, don't just believe things because someone told you. Think for yourself. And the Great Enlightenment actually undid itself because the standard of intellectual autonomy gave birth to a size of science that makes intellectual autonomy impossible. right? Completely impossible.
Yeah.
You have to trust enormously, right?
Yeah.
Constantly. So you're asking a question that I think I don't have a good answer to. I think the essential dilemma that we need to figure out right now is how we can figure out who to trust, given that we don't have the expertise.
Yeah.
I think it's really notable that right now the slogan of conspiracy theory world is do your own research, right? Like
but you can't. I mean, you can't.
Right. The whole point is that when I say COVID vaccines work, I'm not saying I thought for myself. I'm saying, fuck, I have no idea how medicine works. But I am doing some complicated thing about monitoring large scale institutions to figure out which ones are worth trusting and not. But it gets really like how you do this is really complicated. Yeah. So I can. This is what it looks like. So I was just reading. So in my philosophy of data class, we read this book from Jacob Stegenga called Medical Nihilism, in which he thinks that for evidence-based reasons, we should probably trust medicine significantly less than we do, which is, a very uncomfortable stance. But one of the things he thinks is that there are parts of the medical sector, and I think he's particularly interested in the psychiatric sector, where he thinks we have a lot of meta evidence. We have two forms of meta evidence. He talks about this devastating study where there are studies and then there are meta studies about whether that do large scale data analysis and trawling about all the studies. And he points out that actually for a lot of the key drugs we're using right now, especially in the psychiatric sector, there are a bunch of meta studies, and a bunch of the meta studies say the drugs work, and a bunch of the meta studies say the drugs don't work. And then someone did a meta study about the meta studies, and they found the strongest correlation was that almost all the meta studies that said the drugs work were funded by the pharmaceutical industries, and all the ones that were funded independently showed they didn't work. Right.
That's a bummer.
Right. And at that point, you're like, holy shit. But this is a pretty complex assessment. But here's the problem. I don't know that meta study, who funded that shit? And I don't understand stats enough to be able to assess that meta study, right?
Right.
But the complex way. So I was looking at this. I got into this a lot because I'd done this class on the study about the DSM-5, which is the psychiatric manual. And one of the things, there's this huge kerfuffle because Alan Francis, the psychiatrist who'd run the DSM-4, resigned in protest about the lack of transparency in the creation of the DSM-5. And then another journalist discovered large amounts that a lot of the people that sat on the committee from the DSM-5 were taking payments from large-scale pharmaceutical companies. And this is the point where, you want to say things like, well, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but also, right? I also believe that money corrupts. And there's, but again, the worry here is you can also tell a story about this. I know historically that that malicious actors have constructed fake stories about this. So I know that there are misinformation actors out there who've created plausible looking fake stories discrediting climate change science and vaccine science as the result of, there's a story out there that I don't believe in. That's climate change is just the result of profit-oriented solar companies. And so but how do you disentangle those when you actually don't know the science yourself? It's so, I think this is
it's a lot of responsibility on an individual. You can't.
It's an impossible responsibility on an individual.
Right. So you've not arrived at an answer for this question.
No,
or do you have any
I think
guidelines?
Sorry,
for me, I always thought things like meta-analysis and systematic reviews are something one can always rely on. Before I realized that one must check the sponsors, because there's a lot of bias on what studies to include and what not to include. And that's precisely what you're saying. And it's sort of having no ground to stand on. Ultimately, you have to delegate trust. You can't verify everything yourself.
This is, so for me, the half of my work that isn't on aesthetics and games is on trust and the trust in experts. And I think the solution is institutional, right? There's the kinds of entities that can figure out what to do are large scale institutions. But that still creates a crisis for the individual, because now the individual has to figure out which large scale institution to trust. Right now, we have a large scale institution built around mainstream universities and mainstream news publications. And we have another alternate institutional system that's vax denial, climate change denial. But there's an institutional structure too. They have their own journals, right? So what do you do? Like, there's the closest I can come is, so a solution I used to believe in, Philip Kitcher has a solution where he thinks he's a philosopher of science. He has a solution called indirect calibration. He says you can draw lines between scientists, and it looks like this. There's a structure of science that's kind of interconnected. And we know that the people that make airplanes and the people that make bridges, their shit works. We can see that not fall down. And we know that they trust chemical engineers. We know that they trust, chemists, and we know that they trust statisticians. So like, you can draw this line. And I used to believe that much more strongly until I started thinking about how hard it was to draw the line between shit I was sure about, planes don't fall out of the sky, and the medical sector, especially when there are reports from the medical sector that parts of the medical sector have been captured by profit-oriented companies, right. Even though I genuinely, I mean, I'm a person, I can tell you, like, it's I don't have clear guidelines. It's this fuzzy mess. Like, I take antibiotics, I get vaccines, but also there are parts of the medical world where I'm like, profit or motive looks really high there, but I can't read the papers.
Yeah, I once did a podcast with a researcher who studies surgeries, and their conclusion was most surgeries are actually not effective. Surgeries, right, unlike medicines, they're not subjected to randomized controlled trial.
Right.
These are something from the Middle Ages that is still continuing. And if you do a randomized controlled trials against placebo, those surgeries don't show. Even knee replacement, hip replacement, which was such a big shock to me, because this is so common.
This is a place where I'm conflicted too. On the one hand, I have a worry. I've seen the same studies, and I am worried. So the term that Stiganga uses is over medicalization. That there are a lot of things that systematically, a lot of the worries that people in my space have are a lot of the things that we're trying to treat as medical are problems, but they're social problems. They're large scale structural problems. They're problems of poverty or overwork or like the fact that you're working like 100 hours a week, and then. Right. There's a really terrifying book called The Happiness Industry by William Davies, where he's worried that a part of the psychology world that he calls positive psychology has defined basically happiness as the ability to return to work, and that are using medicalization and psychiatrization to get people to be more productive, where actually the answer might be don't work 100 hours a week. That's not something human beings should do. Right. But on the other hand, I also read stuff where I have worries. Here's a meta worry. I'm worried about the standard of randomized controlled trials as a gold standard. So here's an argument I found actually in a book called, I think it was The Science of Yoga, which claims something like, there are kinds of practices and interventions that you can't do RCTs for, like yoga. You can't do a randomized controlled trial of yoga because people know when they're doing yoga, right? That's not the kind of thing that you can do a placebo for, right?
Yeah.
But so RCTs, randomized controlled trials, work really well for pills. They work really poorly for physical or social interventions. And so it would be to the advantage of people that made money off of pills to hold up RCTs as a gold standard when things like, and I think famously, one of the things you can't do a randomized controlled trial about is exercise, right?
Yeah.
We know it's super effective, but there's this is I'm just taking you down the road. I have no idea. Like, basically, one way I've been putting it as a philosopher is we had a standard that we thought worked, which is think for yourself, be intellectually autonomous. And suddenly, within 200 years, we've been catapulted into a completely different world where that standard doesn't work anymore. Well, what works? I have no idea. I genuinely think this is a crisis, and the version of this crisis that we're seeing is the conspiracy theory, vaccine denial world that we're living in. I just don't.
And I don't know. It links beautifully to the simplification, metrification, because in a world of ambiguity where you don't know who to trust, whoever has the most confidence and the simplest thing to say ends up winning the game.
That is exactly what I think. This is exactly the point. This is like I said, I was feeling this big unification between the threads. That's exactly it. I'm worried that in the world of nausea and ambiguity, I really like the way you put it.
Great.
Metrics
Fantastic.
win because they
Yeah.
look. I mean, here's something. Here's a thread. The whole thing that got me excited about this expert identification stuff was a bunch of studies that said that jury trials, juries have to pick which expert witness to trust, and juries are shit at picking expert witnesses. They tend to pick people that state clear, simplistic, confident things, where most experts actually say, well, that's really complicated. There's a bill, I'm like, this is a complicated thing, right? So juries
Unfortunately,
tend
I
to
mean, you say the same things in news shows as well when they invite guests or experts to give commentary on a topic. Generally, people who will say the simplistic thing that's understood by most people,
right.
they end up getting called and shaping the narrative versus a scientist who may say there is 1% probability of XYZ happening, which is completely very complex and opaque thing.
The logic of the pundit.
Right. And it's unfortunate. I mean, it's unfortunate, but like you said, there's no easy way out of it. I think it is what it is.
This is, I think this is the essential problem of the modern scientific world. It is a new problem that humans have never had to deal with before the last 200 years, 300 years of a science that's too large for a human being. And I think we are currently grappling with how to survive.
Yeah, that's true. Great. Thank you for spending time with me. It has been absolute pleasure. When is your book coming and how can people buy it?
My new book is not coming out for about 2 years. I'm writing it over the next year. A lot of the material is, so if you go to my website right now, objectionable.net, most of the pieces of it are have been written as academic articles, and those are available. There's a bunch of public versions, and a lot of this material I've been giving as talks, so people can find it on my website. I've got links to video, but the book itself, you're gonna have to wait for 2 years or.
Got it. I will link to your website and different papers that we talked about in the episode.
Oh, I should say what's coming, the stuff we talked about at the end about the simplification of information. That's the new stuff. If you're interested in the game stuff, my book, Games, Agency as Art, is out. And that's the whole theory of games.
Fantastic. I'll link to that too. Thank you so much. And thanks for spending time with me.
Thank you.
I know we did not arrive at the most important answer at the end, but I guess slowly we'll chip away to maybe something which is more useful than what we have right now.
Yeah, I was just teaching the material to my students, and they're like, "What do we do?" And I'm like, "You people are going to work on this. This is a multi-generational project."
Yeah, I mean, your job as a philosopher is to ask hard questions, and I think you've done that beautifully. So, thank you, Thi, for spending time with me. And
thank you.
Yeah, have a great day ahead. Bye-bye.